All right, here we are. We are live with our Monday night Q&A, and I have two guests with me today.
Yes.
I traded Doyle for two. I feel like I upgraded with one. Two is just out of this world.
Yeah, I feel like you downgraded. But anyways,
I got Matt here with me. If you don't know Matt, he is head of the youth department here at Seacoast. And then I also have J.P. Moreland. Sorry, we're just talking about William Gray. J.P. Moreland, old friend of Seacoast. Not that you're old, but he's just a... You know what I'm talking about, JP.
I actually don't.
Okay, good. We love JP Moreland.
I do know what you're talking about.
We love JP here at Seacoast, and he has spoken here many times. And he decided that he would join us for a Q&A tonight, and so we're excited to have him. And before we get started, I want to make sure that you know how you can ask your questions. And so one of the ways that you can do that is by sending in a text message, and we will receive those. Those are anonymous, so you have some questions that you want to ask, you can do it that way, or through Facebook. Or through our website in the comment section. So there's going to be a number that you see right now that's coming up that you can text in your questions, or you can ask them on Facebook or on our website, and we'll be happy to answer those. So in case you don't know JP, JP is a philosopher, world-renowned philosopher. He was a bit of a hero on campus at Biola when I was there. He's kind of the myth, the man, the legend, and he also, so this could be controversial. Maybe we should start here. Where did you get your PhD from?
Well, I actually got two PhDs. One, I parked my car on the campus of UCLA and left the window open. And when I got back in my car, they'd thrown a diploma in my back seat. So I have that sort of UCLA doctorate, but I actually earned a doctorate from USC.
Oh, there you go. Already starting it off. Okay. That's awesome. So he's got a PhD in philosophy from USC. He also is at Biola and Talbot, and incredibly smart man. Can you just give us an overview of some of your areas of expertise?
Well, I went into philosophy because I was saved through Campus Crusade crew today on the college campus, and I began to evangelize and disciple there. And I was getting asked the questions I couldn't answer. And so were the young Christians I was leading to Christ. They were getting questions they couldn't answer. So I began to realize that the field of philosophy was where most of these questions ultimately came from. And so I went on to do graduate work in theology and philosophy. And my area of expertise currently would be metaphysics and philosophy of mind. I also have an area of competence in ethics and in philosophy of science.
One of the books, or I guess the areas that you've been known for recently is neuroscience and the soul.
Yes, that would be correct.
Good. And so I'm sure we'll probably get to that at some point. If someone doesn't ask you about that, I will. So we'll jump into that in a little bit. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in, and as those questions come in on Facebook and on our website and text message, we're going to be asking you those. So the first question that we just got in is, what is your take on UFOs, and what does the Bible have to say about him?
Well, my take on UFOs is that while I acknowledge that there are some cases that simply cannot be explained. So we have what we might call some unexplained anomalies. I do not think the evidence for UFOs is substantial enough to justify belief in it. I say that quite independently of being a Christian. I say that because the overwhelming number of cases have been pretty adequately explained away through natural processes, and only a handful, relatively speaking, compared to all the reports, have been legitimate problems. But you don't adopt a theory because of some unexplained phenomena where all the other phenomena have been explained without accepting the theory. So I would not accept the idea that there are UFOs based on such a meager amount of data. Contrast that with miraculous healings and miraculous events in the world. There are millions reported all over the world. And so I would not apply the same strategy to the miraculous, because the evidence for it is so widely based that it's you would have to be unfair with the evidence to reject the existence of the supernatural. As far as the Bible goes, I guess I honestly don't think the Bible has anything to say about it. I just don't, when I read the scriptures, I don't think the issue of whether or not there's life elsewhere in the universe is a question that the scriptures are at the least bit interested in addressing. And so I think the only place where there's life is Earth. If you're an atheist, you would almost certainly have to believe that. I know a lot of atheists say, well, there's life all over the place. Well, the fact is, studies have now been done conclusively to demonstrate that the occurrence of life one place in the universe, given a 15.8 billion year old universe, and given how big the universe is, the chances of life occurring once are likened to filling the state of Texas a mile high with quarters, putting an X on one of them, tossing it somewhere in the state of Texas, and getting it on the first draw. Now, if you're going to ask me as an atheist, is there going to be life elsewhere, then you're asking me to believe that we fill the state of Texas a mile high with quarters, we put X's on two quarters and toss them in different places in Texas, and we get those two quarters on our first two draws. There just can't be life anywhere else if there is no God. If there is a God, I suppose that he could create life elsewhere. I think you would have problems with trying to make sense out of the fall, because in my view, it did affect the whole universe. But so I'm inclined to think there isn't, but I can't say with any degree of confidence that that's true just based on scripture, because I don't think scripture addresses the question.
So JP, just for those who might be interested in further study, is what you're talking about there the fine-tuning argument, and how a part of that argument is that we live in the Goldilocks zone here on Earth?
That's a good argument, but it's just a little bit different. Your argument that you just presented takes a look at, let's just say we had a massive number of parallel universes that all existed at the same time, and that the numbers of the charge on an electron or the mass on a proton and about 100 of these specific constants of nature would have to be exactly what they are before life could appear. And so I would think that argument is really good for arguing that the universe had to be designed intentionally so that life could appear on it. My argument is a timeline argument, and it was made by two atheist scientists, a guy named Barrow and a guy named Tipler, who wrote a book called The Cosmological Anthropic Principle with Oxford Press. And they have an estimate as to how large the universe is. We know that it's expanding, and so it has a finite size to it. If we grant that the universe is 15.8 billion years old, and if we take a look at the quickest event possible, which would be a certain kind of quantum event, then you can multiply how long it takes for the smallest event possible to occur times, let's say, 16 billion years, and you can calculate how many events have happened in the history of the universe. Now, given the size of the universe and gravity, we can calculate how much mass is in the universe. And if you break those down into tiny subatomic particles, what you can do is calculate the probabilities that these particles would come together in just the right way to form life. And that probability is so astronomically, ridiculously small that there is not enough events to occur in the history of the universe to make it the least bit likely. And so that is a calculation based upon how old the universe is, how many events have happened in the history of the universe, and the probabilities. And they are not overcome, even if you grant all the events that happen were quantum events and the world is 16 billion years old. So that was their argument, that life could not appear once, much less twice. And the fact that it's here once is absolutely shocking. And I'm thinking, well, how about the God thing? Wouldn't that be a reasonable explanation? But some people don't like
JP, we got lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to let Matt fire the next
so
one.
Next question is, what will Christ's judgment of believers entail?
I guess we're giving you all the light, easy ones at
just
first
the,
here.
Just the
I don't
quick
know.
ones, yeah.
Well, the first thing he's going to ask is, were you a Chiefs or Raiders fan? And the right answer is Chiefs. No, this is a good question. There are two judgments in the scriptures: the Bema Seat judgment in 2 Corinthians 5, and the Great White Throne judgment in Revelation. The Bema Seat judgment is for believers only, and it is a judgment to assess the quality of the works they have done, and there will be rewards given to those who have done greater works. What this shows is that works matter a great deal. They don't matter in terms of whether we're made righteous in God's sight, because that is by grace through faith in what Christ has accomplished. But there will be rewards in heaven given to us, as the scriptures say, according to our deeds. We will not all be equally rewarded, and that will be decided at the Bema Seat judgment. The Great White Throne judgment will be the judgment at the end of the age, when we have resurrected bodies, and that will be the announcement of those who will spend eternity separated from God, and those who will spend eternity in his presence, though believers who die in the Lord before the millennium, in what I believe is the millennial kingdom, will know immediately that they're in the Lord's presence. Now, there appears to be a third. It's not actually a judgment, but it's a life review that tens of hundreds of thousands of people who've died and come back, near-death experiences, have, before Jesus, undergone a life review where they've been able to, with him, see everything that they've done and how that impacted people positively or negatively. Now, that is not recorded in Scripture. That's a different thing that the Bible doesn't mention. And I think its purpose is to help people understand that when they come back, there are significant effects from what they do, and they should be more wise and careful about living according to the scriptural teaching about life.
JP, we got tons of questions coming in, great questions. So I want to make sure I can try to get to as many of them as possible.
All right,
here's one that just came in, or there's a ton that's coming in. Let's go with this one. How serious do you think COVID-19 is, and how should we react to it? I think that's an interesting question.
Yes. I think it's far less serious than we have reacted to. It is a significant virus, and in my opinion, as a non-medical doctor, but from what I've heard and read, it is basically, it does spread quickly, but I think that we have overreacted and shut everything down. Maybe that should have been done the first 4 to 6 weeks when we didn't know what was going on. But it seems like the greatest percentage of people that are dying from this are people that are in their late 70s into their 80s, or have a significant compromised immune system because of chemo or something like that. It follows, I think, that we could have allowed people to work. And I've heard doctors say that they'd be eating at restaurants if they were open. And I think that people need to get back to work, and that we've overbalanced the health issue, which isn't as bad as everybody's claiming, though it does need to be paid attention to. But we have evaluated the impact of joblessness on people's lives. I think that therefore that I don't know what the church ought to do. I mean, this is I think I would probably call for a peaceful resistance, and the churches ought to all go back to church and pick a day like the last of May or something. If the governor is not going to let us go back to church, then we're just going to go back, and they can't throw us all in jail. So
they can try. They might
fill the jails.
Of course, I think we should wear, masks and stuff when we come to church. But that's my view. I'm not an expert. I'm just giving you my $1.98.
Yeah, no, that's good. Okay, Matt, what do you got?
All right, I like this one. Can you help me explain where dinosaurs fit in for a third grader?
Dinosaurs were beings that God created because he is a creative artist. And he likes to create all kinds of interesting looking and what we might even think are a little bit weird looking creatures, but it all expresses his creativity. Some of those creatures that God created, like the dodo bird and the dinosaurs, died and we became extinct. And that's
JP. Are you wearing a mic or something like that? We're getting a lot of static there.
All right, I'll be careful.
Don't lose your passion. Don't lose your passion now.
All right. Well, so I think that's how the dinosaur, what I tell a third grader. Now, the issue is whether you're a young Earth creationist, in which case I think you're going to have to say that the dinosaurs existed during the flood, and God put embryos or infant pairs of dinosaurs that were in hibernation on the ark. If you're an old Earth creationist like I am, then the dinosaurs went extinct before the flood of Noah.
So, okay, I got a question to go along with that. Sorry, whoever, I know we got tons of people asking questions, but really quick, if you can give me a 60-second answer on this one. Something I've been wrestling with is, was there death prior to the fall as far as animal death and predation and things like that?
There was death prior to the fall, and it was because of the fall. So, a missionary needed a hot water bottle out in the remote bush in Africa named Helen Roseveare. You can Google her. And she and the kids prayed that God would give a little hot water bottle for this little child that was going to die if they didn't get one. The next day, and the mail only came every 6 to 8 weeks, but the next day the mail came, and a package came from a Sunday school class in Ohio that had a hot water bottle in it. That Sunday school class packed that box up 5 months before they prayed. The hot water bottle was put in the box because she prayed, but not after she prayed. God, knowing what was going to happen ahead of time, moved on the people in that class to put the hot water bottle in there so that by the time the mail got there and they prayed for it, it would be there right after that. Similarly, God, knowing the fall was going to happen, judged the earth ahead of time so that when Adam and Eve came out of a perfect garden, they would realize with full force the horrible stewardship that they had dropped the ball on and the impact on the creation of what they had done, because the jungle was already red in tooth and claw. The world was fallen and death was present because they fell, but it was there before they fell.
A great answer. That's worth the price of admission.
There it is, right there. There it is.
That was awesome. Okay, cool. Thank you, JP. We'll get back to everybody else's questions.
All right. This is a question that I have as well. It says, do you think God populated the world through incest? If we, take Adam and Eve as literal figureheads and as people.
Well, you have to understand that moral rules in Scripture can be overridden by weightier rules. Jesus himself said in Matthew 23:23 that there were greater and lesser matters of the law, the moral law. Now, they were all true, but some of them had more weight or gravitas. It's like an ace versus a jack. If you're playing cards, the ace trumps the jack. So if there's if the soldiers come to Rahab and say, "Are you hiding Jews?" She lies, and God honors that because what she did was the right thing. In that case, the lying was overridden by the higher duty to protect the Jewish spies. It's wrong to lie unless it's overridden by a great. That isn't an exception, it's an exemption. It's overridden. It's not given leave of absence. Now, the rule of incest, is trumped by a greater principle to multiply and populate the earth. Now, there was no way for God to allow an original pair of people and then their children to honor the command to multiply and populate the earth unless they had relations with each other. There wasn't anybody else around, and that rule of populating the earth overrode the rule against incest because there was no way to honor both principles. Today, you don't need you have to honor the incest rule because there are ways to populate the earth by marrying other people outside your family, but not then.
So some people might push back and say, okay, well then, when Cain ventures out and he's concerned about his safety because of the mark that he's been given, he's afraid of these peoples and cities that are going to kill him. Where did they come from all of a sudden?
The scriptures don't tell us, and I believe that there could have been figurative language that was used to describe all of these cities, and we tend to picture, something like, Denver or Springfield, Missouri, where there's 150,000 people that live there. And quote, cities could have had 50 to 75 people in them, or less in those days. So Bethlehem, when the slaughter of the infants, some say maybe there were 12 to 15 infants killed, because in the city in those days, there weren't that many people that lived there. So I believe that these would have been the result of multiplication that took place among Adam and Eve's offspring. And Adam and Eve.
Okay. Switching gears here, this one's about one of your areas of specialty is the soul and consciousness. And the question is, are soul and consciousness separate? Are they one? How does that all interplay with the body?
Well, take water and a glass and say the water's in the glass. Now, is the water the same thing as the glass? No. The glass is what contains the water. Well, the soul is what contains consciousness. Consciousness is a set of states like sensations, feeling of pain, a taste of an orange, thoughts, beliefs, desires, and exercises of free will. Those are all states of consciousness. And just like water can be in liquid, gas, and solid state, so we can be in a sensing, desiring, thinking, believing, or acting state. And those are all states that are contained in the soul. They're not in the brain, and they're not in the body. When the soul is in the body and the brain, it depends upon the body and brain functioning for it to function. So if I'm in a car and I'm in the front seat and the seatbelt is locked and I can't get out of the car, my ability to move around town depends on the car working. If the steering wheel's fine, I can go left or right or whatever I want to do. If the steering wheel breaks, then my ability to move is limited. I can only turn left and not right. If I could get out of the car, then the broken wheel wouldn't make any difference. Well, in my body, I'm able to function if my brain and so on are working. But if they get broken down, then I can't recall my memories because of Alzheimer's or whatever it might be. But that doesn't prove that I'm my brain any more than the car experiment proves on the car. Now, when I get out of my body, I'm able to be fully functional at that point, even though the brain is not working right, because I am not using the brain any longer like I do when I'm in my body.
Okay, good. And the view of this for further research for people is it substance dualism, or what should they look for?
Yeah, well, the soul is an immaterial substance or thing. It's an immaterial whole or thing that has consciousness and animates the body. So they're animal souls because they're conscious. Matter is not capable of possessing consciousness. Now, matter can cause consciousness. Like if I get stuck with a pin, the C fibers in my brain, certain neurons in my brain will begin to activate, and that will cause consciousness, a feeling of pain. So there's a causal relationship and even a dependency. If I think certain thoughts, it heals my brain chemistry. If my brain's damaged, I can't think certain things. But that doesn't prove they're the same thing. It just shows that they're dependent on each other. And it doesn't show consciousness is possessed by the brain. It just shows that while I'm in my body, the consciousness that's in my soul I can't access it unless the organs of my body are working properly. And the book is The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. The Soul, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. I wrote that a few years ago.
Matt tried to read it.
Yeah.
And is having, let's say, difficulties, maybe. It might, it's not an easy read, I guess.
I highlighted all of it. There's stuff to look. It's a good book. It's good.
It's a great book. Just
be
ready to get into the deep waters. It's deep waters.
It's good stuff, though. It's good stuff.
Do we really want to use Matt as our standard of what?
I just want people to.
Well, I got an average IQ, and so between you two, there's just got to be some average person here.
Okay, Matt, go ahead and throw the next one out.
We have tons of questions, JP, about election and predestination, and I feel like if there's anyone that can settle the matter, it's you. So teach us, tell us about it.
I don't believe in the kind of Calvinist election or predestination because I think that in that case, the reason we're saved is because whether we wanted to or not, or we chose to or not, God decreed that we had to get saved. And he therefore decreed that certain people could not be saved, and therefore, in a passive way, condemned them to hell without them having any choice to be saved. So it would be like me having five life preservers, or three of them, five of them. 5 people are drowning, and I could save all 5, but I just tossed 2 of them life preservers. I don't know what kind of a loving person I would be if I hadn't my power to save all of them and didn't. The Calvinist God doesn't owe us salvation, but if he's loving, then he would want, I don't know what it means to say he's loving when he could save everybody in the world if he wanted to, because it's up to his decree. I don't think that's free will, and I think that we can choose the gospel or choose to reject it. And so God's choosing us is based upon his foreknowledge of what we would do if given the opportunity. And so God chooses certain people to be saved, or predestines or elects them, not according to the counsel of his own will, but in accordance with his love, because he only chooses and elects those that would respond if given the opportunity. And he will not choose those and force them if he knows that if given the chance, they wouldn't say yes. So election and predestination are in accordance with God's foreknowledge and middle knowledge. It's not a fiat decision that is deterministic.
And so for further study, would you hold a Molinist perspective?
Yes, and there's a book on the gospel and the atonement by a Molinist perspective that critiques a Calvinist view of this, and it's called, it's by Kenneth Heathley, Heathley, and I forget the title of it, but it's got salvation in there somewhere. So just look up Kenneth Heathley, and you'll be able to tell which one it is.
In less than maybe 60 seconds, could you give us an overview of what the three views, the three main views are on election?
There are those who think that election is God's choice to decree some to be saved and others to be passed over. There are those who believe that God's election is based upon his foreknowledge. And there are those who believe, as I do, that God's election is based on his love and is consistent with his foreknowledge. Okay. So it's God's love that caused him to choose those he foreknew would respond.
Great. Okay. Few more questions. Not a few. We got a lot of questions.
Yeah, tons.
Where was Jesus during the 3 days after his death, but prior to the resurrection?
The scriptures are very interestingly clear on this. In the Old Testament, when people died, they would go to the bosom of Abraham. Is basically what it was called. Sometimes it's called a grave, but that's a figure of speech for going to be with the ancestors in the bosom of Abraham. Now, when Christ died, the arrangement was changed because that intermediate state before we get resurrection bodies at the general resurrection, so when we die, we exist in a disembodied state, that was changed. And the bosom of Abraham had two unbridgeable compartments. One was paradise, and the other was Hades. And then the final state is Gehenna, or the final hell. And what Jesus was doing was he went to Abraham's bosom and he announced to the people there what he had done, and consequently, people who were already counted as believing in him vaguely based on grace and faith were separated from those who had rejected Jesus based upon what they knew, and into two compartments. And so, in my opinion, Jesus was talking to people, was speaking to people in the intermediate state. By the way, this isn't silly. If you read the book by John Burke, Imagine Heaven, you will see clearly that people do die and go to heaven or to hell and are greeted by the Lord Jesus or demons and return and tell what happened. So this is not a silly story. It's true. That's what happened.
We had John here
Years ago.
when the book first came out, and
Yeah.
he came and spoke on it.
Right.
Okay, let's see here. Matt, what's the next question?
Yeah, so a lot of people have been asking about the prosperity gospel. So what is your kind of view and your take on that?
Pretty tough to preach a prosperity gospel with our brothers and sisters being martyred and living in poverty and having to hide in caves in Muslim countries and elsewhere. The prosperity gospel is the only sort of thing that would survive in a culture like the West. The scriptures do have a more pregnant sense of prosperity. And it says that if you love God and are one of his, then your life will prosper. But that doesn't mean that you will be protected from harm or heartache or even poverty. It just means that you will have a resource to give your life shalom, which is a deep sense of well-being, irrespective of what circumstances you confront. And so I think that there's nothing virtuous about poverty, but the Christian gospel is not fundamentally a sensuous message like the Muslim message about the 72 virgins in heaven, nor is it about the pleasure that would come from being wealthy. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, and don't want people to be in poverty, but the gospel is not about that. It's about offering a form of prosperity that transcends your circumstances. That's my own view on it.
That's great. Let's see here. Let me go to okay, so this is a good question. Who is God? Is he an alien? So how do you? I mean, so I think that maybe at a popular level, there's a conception of God being up in a cloud, and he's got this long white beard, and but that's not probably the correct way to think about God. How do you think about God?
Well, God is a spirit. He doesn't have a body. So if you think about the attributes that God has, he's kind and loving and wise and gracious and powerful and so on. None of these attributes are attributes that you can see or touch or taste or smell. They're attributes that you can grasp with your intuition and your mind, but they're not sense perceptible. God is not, therefore, the kind of thing that you could see or hear or whatever, unless he manifests himself, and then you don't literally see God, but you see a manifestation of him, as he might do in one way or the other. So God is infinite, and he cannot be contained with boundaries, like an object in space. So a space alien is locatable in space and has a size and a shape, and there's a clear boundary as to where the alien's body stops and the rest of space begins. Well, God's not like that. God is not contained within space, and he's boundless in that sense.
Okay, let me switch gears a little bit. This one's more maybe pastoral and theological in nature, and I'll rephrase it a little bit. It's about, is someone born as homosexual, and how do you deal with that if they are, and that I think they're kind of just struggling with that.
There is no evidence that human beings are born homosexual, period. It is a UCLA neuroscientist who I will keep anonymous told me that you can't do research on the gay issue, because if you don't come out with the right answer, your articles won't get published and you will never get funding again. And so study after study is trying to show that we were born, but in the early studies that made that claim, now the scientists who made the claim have retracted the claim. They acknowledge that the evidence is not good enough. And by the way, there book by
We were having some.
Sound
Couldn't,
issues?
you couldn't hear you that well. I don't know if it's on your side or our side there.
all right. There's a book by Alan Schleiman with Stand to Reason on homosexuality that includes all the information. It's about 70 pages thick, and you can get it through Stand to Reason. I think that there could be people born with a genetic predisposition towards homosexuality, but some people are born with a genetic predisposition towards anger or anxiety. I was. And it doesn't follow from that I need to give into that. I can learn to cope with the way I'm predisposed at birth, because this is a fallen world. And not all the things you're predisposed with when you're born are good things. Some of them are fallen. And so I think anybody has a choice at some point of growth to live a chaste life and to not cultivate those fantasies, but to learn to train their minds, like we all have to do, to focus on a different thing. Now, I think that people who have those issues need to be loved and embraced by us. And we need to let them feel safe and accepted for being people. But eventually, we need to do the loving thing and tell them that this is not pleasing to God, like the things we all do, and that the best way to live life flourishingly is to set aside things that don't please Him. And it's in their best interest not to cultivate this.
Okay, we're coming in. We got. Let's see here. We're in our last 20 minutes or 19 minutes, and we still got a lot of questions. Okay, so we're gonna start. We're gonna start powering through all these questions, if that's okay with you. Okay, Matt, fire away.
Yeah, so there's an assumption in this next question, and I'm going to assume that it's right. And the question is, what do you think are the biggest holes in evolution?
The origin of life, the Cambrian explosion, the origin of consciousness, the existence of irreducible complexity, and the need for information for changes to take place in organisms, and you can't explain where information came from.
Towards abiogenesis and the Cambrian explosion would probably be the two largest things you'd point people to.
Yeah.
We're having trouble with the mic again, JP. I'm not sure if that's on your side or our side. There is there.
It's probably my side because I move around a lot. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
We
that's
can.
much
You're
better.
good. You're good.
Much better. Yeah.
You're
Yeah,
good.
yeah. You get excited. I get it. I'm excited too.
All right, I'll be a mannequin.
Okay, Matt, go ahead. Next question.
Who's your favorite philosopher?
It would either be Roderick Chisholm or Richard Swinburne. Roderick Chisholm was not a believer. He believed in God. He may have been a Christian, I don't know. But boy, his views sure were. And he taught at Brown University. And Richard Swinburne taught at Oxford. He's still alive. He's a Christian philosopher.
Great. Let's see. Sorry, I have really bad eyesight, so I can't read the questions.
I'm young, so I got it. What role does baptism play in faith? Do you need it to be reborn or saved?
It is an expression of one's acceptance of Christ that makes a public announcement that I am now His and will seek to live for Him from now on. I identify with His community. It is not necessary for salvation. Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. So that's what the church has almost always held.
A lot of questions about end times.
Yeah.
I'll try to condense them. Do you believe we're in the end times, and what does the end times look like?
Not an area that I've studied, And so I will say that I think it's 50-50 we're in the end times. And that's a pretty good number, because, I mean, there are a lot of things happening that I look at and think, gee, this is kind of crazy. So we could very well be, but this is not an area of expertise for me. So I really don't have a whole lot to say.
Let me see here. Okay, this one is about, this is from a kid, actually, and they're wondering, if God created Adam and Eve, where did all the different ethnicities and races come from?
Well, just like rabbits that are brown, if they move to a part of the world where it's snowy all the time, will develop white coats and no longer have brown coats. They're still rabbits, but they're white rabbits and brown rabbits, and rabbits will change their coats depending on their environment. And I think that what happened is that as the descendants of Adam and Eve migrated to different parts of the world, they took on different skin colors and began to marry others that way, and developed groups that were more like each other than groups that lived in distant parts.
That's good. Okay, this one I want to spend some more time on, because this is what you spoke about last time, and I think this is something that a lot of people are struggling with. Given our current circumstances of uncertainty, how do you reconcile God's promises that He will never leave you or forsake you, and with feelings of panic and anxiety and fear, even after much prayer? So maybe you could talk a little bit about, your journey with anxiety and how you've overcome it, or at least are overcoming it.
This is a really hard question, and I just empathize with anybody who's going through this. I do want to refer you to my book, Finding Quiet, because I address it there in some detail. But I would want to say, first of all, that in American Christianity, we are not teaching people how to draw near to God and attach to Him in an experiential way. That is happening in worship, thank God. Our worship is so good in churches around the country. Thank God for that. That's why I would always try to attend church and hear the word taught and experience good worship. But so God is with us. He doesn't leave us. But we often don't know how to enter into experiencing His presence because we're just not attuned to sensing the supernatural. So I would say that there is a weakness on our part in becoming aware of God who never leaves us. The other thing I would say would be that anxiety and depression are not simply spiritual issues. They're holistic. They involve your soul, your spirit, your life, your soulish life, and your body. So it can be due to brain chemistry or defects in your nervous system or brain, and you need medications. It can be due to psychological trauma and distress, and you might need good, solid Christian counseling and learn how to deal with some of those past hurts. And it can be a spiritual issue that there are certain things you're not practicing. So I would reconcile it by saying that the spiritual is not the only thing to focus on when you want to get well from anxiety or depression. Don't leave out the psychological and the neurological as well as the spiritual. It's all of the above. And then finally, I would say that practice doing certain things. And I've got 4 practices in the book that apparently I have found just life-changing. But anxiety is a habit, largely a habit that's formed, and you can unlearn that habit by forming other habits. And I mentioned those in the book.
That's great. Yeah, and definitely if you don't have that book, get it. I have enjoyed it, and I know there's been so many other people, especially after you came and you spoke, that purchased it, and their lives have been impacted by it. So that's great. Okay, let's. We're running out of time here, so we're going to try to make it through. We got 10 minutes left, and we got pages of questions, which is great. Thank you guys for sending in all those questions. Great questions that are coming in. Matt, which one do you want to ask?
This is the one I'm super interested in, and so I'm glad somebody else asked it. And there's actually tons of people that asked a very similar question. And so it has to do with kind of the book of Acts, being baptized in the Holy Spirit with evidences of speaking in tongues. And so it seems in the book of Acts there was a separation between salvation and being baptized in the Holy Spirit. Is there one today? And what role does speaking in tongues play today in the lives of a believer?
Separate questions. My view is that there is not a separation, that we are baptized in the Spirit when we become born again. And I cite 1 Corinthians 12:13. I think in the book of Acts, you have so many different ethnic groups. And the question that the apostles are trying to figure out was, are these people accepted in the faith? I mean, what about the Samaritans? And what about the Gentiles? And so I think what happened was that the message of salvation was given. And in the case of the apostles, they were immediately baptized with the Spirit, and they did speak in tongues. But I think as other ethnic groups were touched, there was a delay of the baptism of the Spirit, because that would give the church in Jerusalem proof that they had been accepted into the community of faith, so that the church did not start dividing early on. That's not needed any longer. There are different kinds of speaking in tongues. There is a gift of tongues, which is basically the ability to speak a language, either a known language or a language to God, and it can be done in evangelism or in a service, as long as it's done properly and in order. And I think there has to be a way to monitor who gets to do that. They have to be checked out. And then there has to be an interpretation, and only 2 or 3. And I don't think it's required. There's another kind of speaking in tongues that I believe is distinguished in 1 Corinthians 12-14. And that is a private way of crying out with groanings too deep for words. And that is speaking with sounds and emotions to God, and hoping he will understand what you don't understand while you're doing it. And it's a way of expressing deep emotion and intimacy without verbalizing in terms that you can understand. I don't think that that's for everybody. I don't think that the gift of tongues is for everybody. I think some people have it. And so I don't see tongues myself as a sign of anything, and it's a limited gift for certain people, and can be used for those who would like to practice it in private prayer, but that's not for everybody.
Okay, this question is another one that I wanted to ask, and someone asked it, so I'm going to ask it. Is when did Jesus know that he was God? Did he know the whole time? And how much did he limit his knowledge when he came into human flesh? How did that work?
It is now widely acknowledged by New Testament scholars that Jesus never did anything out of his divine nature. Everything he did as a human being, full of the Spirit, as he saw his Father leading. So that means that we're capable of doing the things Jesus did. Now, I don't have time to argue that. Let's just grant that for the sake of argument. This is becoming by far the majority view of New Testament scholars. Jesus, there are a lot of things I know right now that I'm not letting myself tap into. The multiplication tables, the first presidents of the United States, and so on. Now, I know those because I could bring them to mind anytime I want to, but I don't think of everything I know all at the same time, or my head would explode, as would yours. Now, when Jesus was on earth, he could do the same thing we do, only what he did was suppress his divine knowledge. He did not tap into it. So he did not allow himself to be aware of what he knew as God. He only tapped into his human mental faculties and did not allow himself to access anything else. So I think that he functioned out of purely human consciousness and mental powers. And as he got older, I don't really know when, but I think it may have been somewhere between, around 12 years old or so, because at 12, he's in the, dialoguing and teaching the rabbis. And he says to his mom, when she says, "Where were you? Don't you know I had to be about my father's business?" Now that is the intimate father-son language that is only reserved for the Messianic king, who, according to the Old Testament, would be divine. So I'm thinking by 12 years old, it had dawned on him through the Spirit's help, not because he was divine, but because of the Spirit's enlightenment, that he was the Son of God.
Really good.
I don't know that, but that's my best guess.
Hey, I believe it, man. That sounds like a good guess to me.
All right.
Okay, we probably have time for maybe one or two more questions, Matt.
Yeah. So, define or describe hell. There's been a lot of questions of people kind of asking, like, what must it be like? What must it look like?
And then let's also add, because I know that that's in there as well, is that even just?
Is hell just? Yeah, absolutely.
Is hell something that is just?
And eternal, yeah.
Well, hell is separation from God. There's no flames in hell. Those are clearly figures of speech. If you say they're real, then hell is also outer darkness. And how can you have darkness, complete darkness, with flames? You end up getting contradictions here. It's clear that Jesus says when he comes back, he will come as a burning flame. That means he'll come in judgment. So the flames are symbols or figures of speech for divine judgment. Hell is an absence away from God or anything that matters. My own view is that it is increasingly listless. If you look at people, the more debauched they get as time goes on, the more they become sort of they're almost like zombies. And I think this is speculation, but that the longer people live narcissistic lives separated from God, the more they're going to become fragmented personalities and falling apart. I think that hell is just because God has no alternative, because he won't annihilate people made in his image. That would be to destroy people that bear value, and he can't get them all saved. And so the only thing he can do is quarantine them. And so that's one of the reasons why I think hell is the only option God has.
I think quarantine is probably pretty close description of hell, I think is what you were saying there, right?
I guess if you have kids. Huh?
Yeah.
Let's see. I think we got time for one more question, and then I wanted to actually revisit a story that we had talked about to end us. Let's see. What should the last question be here? I want to make sure it's a good one. Sorry for everybody who
There's a lot of them.
Weren't able to get to all of your questions. Matt, what's the last one? I'm going to let you choose the last question.
Scroll down a bit. There was a question that you went too far. Where was it? Oh, you mentioned you hold to an old Earth view. Why is that?
I think the Bible allows for both views, young and old Earth. I saw two top Old Testament scholars debate this. They both had doctorates from Harvard and believed in the inerrancy of the Bible. One held the young Earth, the other held an old Earth view, and they were both just unbelievably godly men who loved the scriptures and knew what they were talking about. If they couldn't make their minds up, then I can't either. So I'm going to allow for young and old Earth, but their scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of the old. So I allow that to tip the scales. I wouldn't go with the science if I didn't think the interpretation was within bounds of legitimate interpretation of scripture. But given this case, since both are on the table, I think, then I go with the old Earth view.
Okay. To end our time, I wanted to recount a story that took place last time you were at Seacoast and you were speaking. And at the last service, you got up, and I was about to make an introduction of who you are and what you do. And before I could even get anything out, you stopped me, and you did something I was definitely not prepared for. Can you recount what had happened?
I was sitting on the front row, and I could feel over my left shoulder as I was looking at the pulpit in the stadium seating. As you look at the congregation, it's high up over to the right. I could feel dark demonic presence there. And I believe then the Lord spoke to me and said, there is a person that came today who is going to commit suicide. They are being drug into despair by being demonized. I want you to cast the demon out of that person and tell them I love them and I have a future plan for them. So I got up and I did that. I just said, I'm sensing that in this section, someone has come today and you are planning on taking your life. And I believe that what the Lord wants us to do is to tell the demon that is disturbing you that he has to leave. And so we prayed against that demon. And I guess one of the staff members on your church, a month or
was the first time that and only time that's happened at Seacoast, which after you say what's next may need to happen more often.
Yes, yes.
But I was very unprepared for you. Could have at least given me a heads up that you were going to do that before we started.
Hey, dude, I was unprepared too, man. It just came on me. But, you can finish the story. Tell them about the woman that came.
So the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, is that a woman had come to that service, and she did not regularly attend. She was just kind of visiting, and she had been a few times before that, but she felt like she should go to church. And she was going through a pretty horrendous circumstance. Pretty much everything was going wrong in her life, and some tragic things were taking place. And she was going to commit suicide. And so she came up to my dad, actually, just a couple months later and said, I was there that weekend. He pointed directly at me, and he was who I was talking about. He was who I was talking, who he was talking to in that moment. And that is what gave me enough hope to continue to move forward. And so I ended up, I think, texting you and telling you kind of what had taken place.
Well, it was a supernatural event. There's no doubt about that.
Amazing. Well, JP, thank you so much for spending time with us. I wish we could have a little bit more time so I could ask you all these great questions, but that just means we're going to have you back.
Well, I love you guys, and I love your church, and you know that. Always want to be with you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll see you next time. God bless. God bless. Guys, next time as well. Have a great week. God bless.
Bye, guys.